First malaria, now leprosy? Is Florida becoming a hotspot for infections we thought we never would have to deal with again? Well, it is Florida. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, it's Dr. David. So yeah, leprosy. Did you even know that leprosy was still around? And this, of course, is on the heels of the recent cases of malaria, which is something that we didn't think was a thing in America anymore. But yeah, it's happening all right here, folks. Wonderful. Now, as far as this surge of leprosy that's happened, and surge is the word that's being used because there's usually so little of it, but it still is a pretty rare phenomenon, and we shouldn't be running around like crazy, trying to figure out what's going on yet. We'll find out more, but it's not something we all should be all too worried about. The thing is this: 20% of all cases in the country in the past year have been here in Florida. More so, 80% of the cases in Florida have all been in the central Florida area around Orlando. Okay, so that in and of itself is a little bit concerning of why it's being concentrated into this one. And as we'll talk about a little bit more, we're not really quite sure yet, but there are some possibilities. Now, knowledge of leprosy, really, we probably all know it goes back to biblical times. It was first mentioned in Leviticus, where they talk about the proper way to cleanse and purify oneself after getting leprosy. And we know that Jesus in the New Testament talked about him healing people and curing people from leprosy. Now, it is not really known or even felt that the leprosy that was described in the Bible was actually this particular bacteria that we're going to talk about. But nonetheless, we're going biblical on this stuff here now. So, wow, how about that? Now, the disease itself, leprosy, it peaked in the United States back in the 1980s, and it's been going down. But there are less than 200 cases per year where it's happening. Now, there are 200,000 cases globally, so it's not a nothing disease. Obviously, that's a number, right? 200,000. Now, in America, up until recently, most of the cases were actually immigrants who came into the country bringing it. Okay, but now about a third of the cases seem to be from only from people who never had any exposure to people from outside the country or never left the country. So that's a bit concerning too. So let's first talk about what leprosy is in the first place. It's caused by a bacteria called Mycobacterium leprae. Okay, now this is actually in the same genus as tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And, and there are actually over 190 different species of Mycobacterium, although you almost never hear about any of the other ones. So as far as there is some good news here, when diagnosed, okay, leprosy is usually an easily treated condition. Now, the weird thing is that you have to use 3 different antibiotics, and they're not antibiotics that most people have ever heard of. Okay, they're atypical. One is called dapsone, one is called rifampin, and the other is called clofazimine. Okay, clofazimine. And again, as I said, the other good news is that it's a very rare thing in America, even though we're seeing this surge happening here in Florida. Now, how does it affect the body? Now, first of all, this is a very slow-growing bacteria. And it primarily affects the skin and the peripheral nervous system, which means the nerves that are not in the brain. Okay, and the course of the disease has a lot to do with a person's individual susceptibility to the bacteria in the first place. And often it just shows up as some small little white patches that can be scattered through the body. They can be a little less pigmented, not necessarily white, but lower pigmented patches than what you'd see in the normal skin. Okay, now, but in more severe cases, the rash can become red. They can become like little papules, like little raised dots, and they can become, they can spread through the body. They can develop nodules or bumps as well and under the skin. Now, in addition to that, it can affect the nerves of the skin and therefore make the rash be painful in of itself. So obviously most rashes, they may itch, but usually we don't say, this hurts me, my skin is hurting. We do see that with chicken pox. Varicella. So shingles can cause it, but most viruses, the rashes don't cause pain. Okay, and so it really also the skin itself can become thickened. okay, especially on the forehead. And for some reason, the ears can become enlarged. Now, if it goes even further than that, undiagnosed symptoms can even progress to muscle weakness and paralysis. It can cause nosebleeds. That's kind of an interesting one. And it can even cause eye problems that can lead to blindness. So, obviously, identifying this bacteria, first of all, people have to think about it. I can honestly tell you that in all my years of being a pediatrician, and as you can imagine, we see rashes all the time. Never once have I ever said, I wonder if this is leprosy, right? I mean, come on. I mean, I'm sure it was mentioned to us in medical school, but I'm pretty sure it was not in any kind of like detailed anything beyond that or something that we studied in any great detail, because it's leprosy. It's biblical. It's not really around. Okay. Now, how does this bacteria spread? Okay. Now, the bacteria spreads through prolonged close contact with something or someone that has the bacteria. Okay, and it's transmitted via droplets. Okay, when a person coughs or sneezes, but it's not aerosolized. Like, we kind of had talked at the early part of COVID. You may have heard that we were talking about, it's also respiratory droplets and it falls to the ground, and therefore it's not contagious as much. Which, of course, we knew was actually not true. We learned that it was aerosolized and it could spread many, many, many feet and contaminate an entire room. That's not going to happen here. You're not going to catch leprosy because you have a casual encounter with somebody or in the same room with them that it turns out that they have leprosy. Okay. Now, it can also take months for a person to have the bacteria to even know about it. Okay. But also, it will take months of exposure to that person for you to get it. Okay. It's believed also, but this is something else that's weird. Most people, 95% of people, are actually genetically programmed through our innate immune system to be able to fight it off. So that's why most of the time, again, you may not hear about it or hear about something, very light and not to progress to these, because only 5% of the population, actually their immune systems are not pre-programmed to fight this off. So I guess maybe going back to biblical times, if that's where the bacteria actually goes back to, maybe we've had enough built into our genetics in order to be susceptible to it. But you don't have to be exposed to it. It's innate. It's born to us. So it's not like other things where you have to build up immunity to it before you have protection against it. Okay. Now, why is this happening in Florida? As I kind of alluded to before, we don't actually know. But it's interesting because the 9-banded armadillo, which is actually quite popular and found here in all areas of the state of Florida except in the Everglades itself, they carry this bacteria. Okay. Now, none of the current cases, however, have there been any type of exposure to an armadillo. Okay. But this month, there was an interesting case that was published as a case study by the CDC of a 54-year-old man who lives in Central Florida his entire life, never traveled. However, he does do landscaping, spends lots of times outdoors, lots of times in soil. And the investigators from the CDC are questioning, not proof, if maybe he was working a lot in soil that had maybe armadillo droppings or something like that. But let's face it, there's lots of landscapers out there. There's lots of people who do garden work every day who don't develop leprosy. So I get maybe he was the susceptible one. I don't know. But nonetheless, we don't know that for sure. I imagine, we'll learn more. But in terms of, here are some concluding thoughts. How can we protect ourselves from until we know more? Okay, so the most important thing is just kind of know the signs and symptoms, like I described. Maybe look some pictures up online so that if you see something, say something, right? Let your medical provider know. One can biopsy the skin, etc. They can do some stainings of it to see if the bacteria is there. Special tests. You can't just like put it on a regular petri dish and find it, because as I said, it's a very slow growing bacteria. Okay, I guess we could say don't get too cozy with armadillos, right? Because they're such cuddly pets that we all have, right? But now, just to let you know, there is actually a vaccine. It's called BCG, and this is what's used in underdeveloped countries who have tuberculosis, and that is a vaccine given. But it is not a vaccine that's given in America. Okay, we don't vaccinate against tuberculosis. In fact, tuberculosis is so rare that if you may remember, if you're of a certain age, where you used to get a skin test that they would put in there to see if it swelled up, that would indicate you have tuberculosis. Turns out that many of those were false negatives. and people were being treated with antibiotics unnecessarily, which actually led to tuberculosis resistance because of the antibiotics. So this is not something that is typically done in America. There's not the CDC, nobody is recommending that you go out and get a BCG vaccine. Not that you could probably get one anyway. So it's something to know about, not something for us to freak out about. But what else could we do? Well, we certainly have talked here on this channel about lots of ways to strengthen the immune system. And we know that a strong immune system seems to make a person not susceptible. So getting good sleep, exercising, eating healthy, avoiding high sugar types of foods, making sure your vitamin D and zinc levels. I haven't put a vitamin D and zinc plug in for at least 2 weeks. So there you go. I think that may be the longest I've gone without mentioning them. But all of those things support a healthy system. So stay tuned. But as this is a slow growing bacteria, I suspect this will be a slow growing story as well. Have a nice day.